Hello everyone. So this is Thoughty2. The real life Revenant was so much worse. Everyone know the movie with Leonardo DiCaprio? Came out in 16, 15, 16. It's awesome. If you haven't seen it, it's a brutal, true story. Although, it's not exactly true how it plays out in the movie. But let's get into it.
Hey, Thoughty2 here. It's no secret that Hollywood has a habit of playing fast and loose with the truth in the name of entertainment. And we all know that the words based on real events are actually code for we made 90% of the plot up to make it more interesting. There's a long list of movies based on so-called true stories that have been significantly spiced up for the silver screen, from Catch Me If You Can to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The Revenant, starring Leonardo DiCaprio, is an...
I just watched Catch Me If You Can, oh man, maybe 2 months ago. I forgot how awesome that movie was. How true it was, a little different, but how awesome it was really good.
Another good example. Released in 2015 to critical acclaim, the film tells the story of American frontiersman Hugh Glass, who gets horrifically mauled by a grizzly bear before going on an epic journey to wreak his revenge on the men who abandoned him in the aftermath. It sounds like textbook Hollywood hyperbole, and The Revenant certainly took some serious liberties with the truth. In fact, outside of the bear mauling itself, almost every major plot point in the entire film is utter nonsense. But here's the funny thing, whilst it's absolutely true that Hollywood had its wicked way with Hugh Glass's story, if anything, the fictional retelling was actually significantly less epic than the real events of his life. I mean, they didn't even mention the part where he was forced to become a pirate, or the bit where he watched his friend burnt alive with slivers of superheated pine. And no, I'm not making that up. This is the true story of Hugh Glass, a tale so incredible, Hollywood toned it down to make it more believable.
That's interesting.
Now, I have to admit, I get frustrated when companies treat my personal data like a commodity that can be bought, sold, and auctioned to the highest bidder. And recently, it's been an issue that's been concerning me even more, since the number of data breaches worldwide is on the rise. In 2021, there was... We don't know a whole heap about Hugh's early life, but he was probably born sometime around 1783 near Philadelphia. These days we know him as a famous frontiersman and bare-knuckled boxer of bears, but when he first pinged into existence on history's radar, he was actually a sailor. His ship was attacked by pirates somewhere off the coast of what is now Texas in 1819. Most of the crew were killed, but after acquitting himself particularly well in the fight, Glass was given a choice: ally with the pirates or join the rest of his crew, leaking blood and guts on the deck. After deliberating for several microseconds, Glass chose the former. As is the case with most bold career changes, becoming a pirate wasn't easy. For one thing, there was a lot more raping and pillaging than Glass was used to, and despite having a solid work ethic, he never really took to it. At what I like to think of as his first pirate annual appraisal, Glass's new boss, the notorious pirate Jean Lafitte, was not pleased. As punishment for his perceived crimes, Glass was set to stand trial before Lafitte, besides another condemned crew member. Both men knew their fate would be a long walk from a short plank. So they made a run for it, which quickly became a swim for it. They were 2 miles out to sea at the time, but somehow both of them made it to shore alive, where they set about living off the land, avoiding search parties and trying not to get eaten by cannibals.
Oh.
They were in Karankara territory, a Native American tribe well known for their predilection for human flesh. I should point out that there's no evidence the Karankara were actually cannibals. The rumour seems to have been started by Spanish colonists, and it stuck. Still, Glass and his buddy didn't know that, and quite understandably, they had no intention of putting it to the test. Keeping a low profile, the two men headed north in search of friendly settlements. 700 miles later, in what is now Kansas, they were captured by members of the Pawnee tribe. Now, on the bright side, the Pawnee weren't cannibals. On the shit side, they did practice ritual human sacrifice. Yay. Soon after they were caught, Glass's travelling companion was stripped naked and burnt at the stake. As he died, his writhing body was stabbed repeatedly with burning splinters of pine wood. Glass would have been next, but as the tribesmen began to prepare him for the ceremony, he reached into his pocket and produced a vial of a red ore called cinnabar, which he presented to the tribe's chief with a deep bow and awaited his fate with dignity. Cinnabar was highly prized by the Pawnee, and the chief was so impressed with the gift, as well as the gravity and respect with which it had been given, that not only did he spare Glass's life, he accepted him into the tribe. It's thought that Glass went on to live with the Pawnee for several years, and there's a pretty good chance his later feats of survival were made possible, at least in part, by the things he learnt from them. So there you have it, Boba Fett was actually a prequel to the Revenant. Anyway, he left the tribe sometime in the early 1820s, making his way to St. Louis, where he responded to an advert to join the recently formed, and soon to be world famous, Rocky Mountain Fur Company. The company, founded by William Ashley and Andrew Henry, was seeking tough men to join a 2,000-mile expedition up the Missouri River to the recently established Fort Henry, which was to serve as a base for fur trapping both on the river itself and in the Rocky Mountains to the west. The men who joined that now legendary expedition will come to be known as Ashley's 100, and they were some of the toughest men ever to have lived, including some now household names like Jedediah Smith and Jim Bridger.
Jedediah Smith. Can't say I've heard Smith. Obvious last name, pretty common. Jedediah. Jim Bridger. I can't say I've heard of either of them. Which, I'm not like an expert, but I don't think I've heard of either of them. I would have to know more about their lives, and maybe there's some battle or something like that where I could say, oh, okay, that's kind of where I would know them from, but the names themselves I don't know. Sorry to those two gentlemen.
Progress up the river in two large boats was slow but steady until an attack by members of the Arikara tribe left 14 of Glass's new colleagues dead and many more injured. Glass himself was shot in the leg during the skirmish, and the men were forced back downriver. Founders William Ashley and Andrew Henry had sunk a huge amount of capital into the expedition, and returning home empty-handed simply wasn't an option if the fledgling company was to survive. With the Missouri deemed too dangerous, the group split into two. One, led by Ashley, went west in search of beaver and immediate profits, whilst the other, led by Henry and including Glass, went north to Fort Henry on foot in the hope of bypassing the Arikara. The plan was only partially successful, and the group ended up in several more minor skirmishes with the locals. But for Glass, the biggest danger wouldn't come from muskets and tomahawks, but teeth and claws. He was out hunting one day when he heard a sudden commotion in the undergrowth. He turned to see a massive shape hurtling towards him at full speed, and he had just enough time to raise his rifle and fire before the creature was on him. If you've seen The Revenant, you'll know exactly what happens next. Glass had inadvertently disturbed a mother grizzly bear and her cubs. Grizzlies aren't exactly friendly at the best of times, but a mother with her young is the dictionary definition of overprotective. Glass was mauled to an inch of his life. Now, the way the story's usually told, he managed to stab the bear to death during the struggle, but the truth is, an adult grizzly in full-on attack mode is practically invincible once it gets up close. And chances are, it was Glass's companions, alerted by his screams, who brought the bear down with sustained musket fire.
These guys got machine gun muskets?
To begin with, they thought Glass was dead too, until someone noticed his chest was still rising and falling. Amazingly, death was not yet calling, but one of his legs was broken, and his back was so badly lacerated that his ribs were visible beneath his bloodied skin. It was obvious to everyone that Glass wouldn't last. So they made him as comfortable as they could, strapped him to a makeshift stretcher and continued on their way. They didn't get far. Glass was a dead weight, severely hampering their pace in this treacherous place. They were still in Arikara territory, after all. With little other choice, Henry offered a reward of $80, the equivalent of a couple of grand in today's money, to any men who would stay behind with Glass in his final hours to give him a proper Christian burial. Two men stepped forward. The first was a veteran trapper named John Fitzgerald, and the second was a 17-year-old rookie, identified only as Bridger. Some historians believe this was probably Jim Bridger, who would go on to become one of the world's most famous frontiersmen of the old American West.
Okay.
Fitzgerald and Bridger no doubt assumed they were going to make some easy cash. Glass was at death's door, with the only sign he hadn't already been invited inside for tea and hobnobs with the Grim Reaper being the occasional flicker of the eyes. But day after day went by, and whilst Glass certainly wasn't getting any better, he wasn't dead either. Fitzgerald and Bridger were getting twitchy. Nobody had expected.
Wait a minute. Look back here.
Any better, he wasn't dead either. Fitzgerald and Bridger
Well, why didn't they just take him to the road? Jeez.
were getting twitchy. Nobody had expected Glass to live this long, and $80 was beginning to look like inadequate compensation for this dangerous task. After 5 days went by with no sign of Glass expiring, they decided to act. They took his rifle, knife, and flint, and left him for dead. The two men reached Fort Henry just a couple of days after the rest of the group, and duly confirmed that Glass was dead and buried, safe in the knowledge that there was no way he could possibly come back and prove them wrong. I'm guessing they'd never seen The Lion King. Glass, meanwhile,
They probably have never seen The Revenant.
had broken from his stupor, still alive but in dire straits. He managed to splint his broken leg, but the rest of his injuries were beginning to fester and he had no supplies or survival gear. Pretty much the only thing he did have was a burning desire to get his revenge on the men who'd robbed him and left him to die alone in the wilderness, hundreds of miles from home. They say the journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step, but that assumes one can actually walk. Hugh Glass's long road back to civilization most likely started with a 3-inch scrabble and a very loud scream. Most people would have given up there and then. He was 300 miles from the nearest settlement, a small trading post called Fort Kiowa, and the journey there presented a whole host of hazards. But Hugh Glass was not most people. He was an ex-pirate who'd survived being shot in the leg and mauled by a bear, and who'd learnt to survive in the wilds of North America from the very people who'd lived there for millennia. Day by day,
Day by day.
Day by day, he dragged himself onwards, drinking water from streams and mashing passing insects into his mouth for nourishment. After about a week of this pitiful existence, he stumbled across a pack of wolves feasting on a buffalo calf. He waited patiently for the predators to eat their fill, then dragged himself over to the carcass. It was a find that very probably saved his life. He set up a makeshift camp nearby and gorged on buffalo meat until his strength returned. As he slowly recuperated, he allowed maggots to proliferate in the worst of his wounds. Now that might sound like a truly terrible idea, but maggot therapy is actually an FDA-approved biotreatment for various ailments, even today. In Glass's case, the writhing yellow larvae ate away his rotting flesh, preventing gangrene. He was still badly wounded, but when he set out again for Fort Kiowa, he was able to move far more freely. When he hit the Missouri River soon afterwards, he either borrowed a skin boat from a friendly tribe of Lakota, or possibly fashioned his own, depending on which source you read. Either way, the next leg of his journey was significantly smoother than the first. He simply floated downriver all the way to Fort Kiowa, arriving approximately 6 weeks after his date with destiny at the paws of the grizzly. After this epic journey back to civilization and safety, you might think Hugh Glass would have put his feet up for a bit. But whilst most of his physical injuries had healed, the mental ones had not. The men who'd abandoned him to die were still out there somewhere, living their lives as if nothing had happened. Glass was determined to put that right. After just a couple of days at the fort, he heard about a new expedition heading back up the Missouri in the direction of Fort Henry, where he assumed Fitzgerald and Bridger would be waiting. Glass signed up immediately. It turned out to be an eventful trip. The expedition was only due to go as far as a group of villagers about halfway between Fort Kiowa and Fort Henry, and so Glass planned to hike the rest of the way on his own. The day after he split with the other members of the group, they were ambushed by the Arikara, and every single one of them was slaughtered.
Wow.
Glass did have a run-in with the Arikara himself. He only narrowly escaped with his life after warriors from a rival tribe came to his aid. When he finally arrived at Fort Henry after 6 weeks on the river and a month of solo hiking, instead of an epic showdown with the men who'd wronged him, he found absolutely nothing. Fort Henry had been abandoned, and according to a note he found pasted to the door, relocated nearby. In the end, he strode into Fort Henry 2.0 more than 4 months after he'd been mauled by the grizzly. The men stationed at the fort must have thought they were seeing a ghost. After all, they had it on good authority that Glass was dead and buried. Not our friend Bridger though. He knew exactly what he was seeing. A big fucking problem. I think everyone can relate to that horrible sinking feeling you get when someone catches you in a lie. I'm guessing Bridger felt it too, only worse, because his lie was also pointing a gun in his face. In the end, he needn't have worried. Glass was out for revenge, but he was also a reasonable man. Bridger seemed to be genuinely remorseful for his crime, and after pleading his case to Glass, the grizzled frontiersman ultimately decided that, as the older man, the real blame lay with Fitzgerald. Unfortunately, Fitzgerald had left the camp more than a month earlier to join up with the army at Fort Atkinson in what is now Nebraska. But by this point, winter had set in, and it was a full 2 months before Glass could set off in not-so-hot pursuit. After another long hike and yet another deadly run-in with the Arikara, Glass finally made it to Fort Atkinson, where he found himself face-to-face with John Fitzgerald. Glass was a simple man. He didn't embark on some long speech or ask Fitzgerald to explain his actions. He simply pulled out his gun, leveled it at Fitzgerald's head, and did absolutely nothing. Just at the moment he'd been about to pull the trigger, a nearby army officer pointed out that murdering a member of the American military in cold blood was a capital offense. In other words, if Glass shot Fitzgerald, he'd be hanged immediately. It must have taken a huge amount of willpower to lower his weapon, remember what he'd come through to get to this point, but lower it he did. However, he left Fitzgerald with a parting promise. If he ever left the protection of the army, Glass would find him, and he would kill him, because he had a very particular set of skills, skills he'd acquired over a very long career. Glass would live on the American frontier for the rest of his life, trapping, trading, hunting, and exploring. He was a veteran of many battles with the various tribes whose lands the United States of America was slowly claiming for its own. But it was in 1833, at the approximate age of 50, that his luck finally ran out. He and 2 fellow trappers were ambushed by a large party of Arikara braves whilst crossing a frozen river. They were all shot, robbed, and finally scalped. In the years since, Hugh Glass's remarkable story has quite rightly achieved legendary status. But as with many legendary tales, there's a fairly good chance that some of it isn't true. Much of what we know about Glass's life comes from sources that are hard to trust entirely, and rumour has it, Glass himself was fond of telling tall tales, particularly when they concerned himself. Exactly where we should draw that line between fact and fable is up for debate, but one thing's for certain. Even if only a tenth of the stories told about Hugh Glass are true, he was undeniably one of the most remarkable men and greatest survivors ever to have lived. Thanks for watching.
I kind of knew the story about him not being able to kill Fitzgerald because he was in the military. I thought he went to... No, he goes to Texas in the movie. Yeah. But yeah, I knew that he wasn't able to get him. Real life Revenant. Yeah. That's your homework. Go watch The Revenant. It's a great movie. I'm going to be watching a couple movies today. It's Saturday. 2:36 p.m. So I have a couple movies I picked out that I have not seen in a long time. I'm going to rewatch Traffic. But I'm really excited. LA Confidential. Oh, that's going to be a good one. I like both of them. But it's not about that. It's about this. And we are done. I've done 11 videos today. So I am calling it right now. So like and subscribe. And until next time, have a good day, have a good night.